The Awake Space Astrology Podcast. I'm Laurie Rivers, your host, here to help you with some inspiration to get those aspirations out into the world. This week, I am so excited to be sharing a very special interview with the astrologer and therapeutic ally, Mark Jones. I met Mark when I was in England, and I went to the London School of Astrology's charity event at the Royal Albert Hall. Mark was one of the keynote speakers, and he had me in tears. And I don't like to cry in public, but as he spoke of his life's work, he spoke to my own, and we come at it from different directions, but it's such a pleasure to share Mark's work with you today. Now, it was a very long interview. We had a wonderful conversation, so I've given you some of the real meat and potatoes here, and I've giving you the very end of it, because if you are a therapist or a coach and are wanting to gain tools that pair with astrology, you really want to check out Mark's courses and his coach training. So I put a little bit of that, and you can check out where to find him in my show notes. But we had a rousing conversation, and some of the real interesting bits when we get into the metaphysics and spirituality side of things are going to be in part 2 in the Patron Only podcast. So patrons, you have that to look forward to this week. It's about a half an hour worth of interview that you get today. Out of the 52 minutes that we did speak, there's a little bit of dog noise. I mostly was able to get muted before the dogs were yapping, but you know, that's life, right? Here at the Awake Space Astrology Podcast. Now, for those of you who finally got the July magazine, I know, it was just crazy getting that done, because some of the articles were a lot longer than normal, especially the Training Your Mercury one, where we talk about cognitive dissonance and how to work on yourself without running into that. And I give you a little bit of a peek of what we do in the mystery school. So you'll notice that the magazine started and stopped with some wisdom from the great writer Douglas Adams. Don't panic. I don't want you guys panicking through July and August. It is a bit of a poop show. Let's put it that way. But we make it through, guys. We do. I think there's always room for optimism, because without hope, we don't have very much room to grow, do we? And panic doesn't serve us at all. So patrons, you'll get your story time audio where I read through the articles. So that'll come out later this week. But for now, I want you to grab your coffee, your matcha, your water. Make sure you're hydrating if you're in those heat waves. And if you got drenched or you had to deal with the tropical storms, I hope you're okay and I hope you're well. Deep breaths. It's going to be quite a summer. So, but panic? No. Towels, however, will come in handy. All right, let's get to the rest of the podcast. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you need to know about the energy this week. Then we're going to do some patron shout outs, because by golly and by gosh, we keep growing. It's crazy sauce. Thank you to everyone who's joined in the last week, and hopefully I catch you all in this patron shout out. We'll do 2 again this week. And then, I think I'll leave you with a note of hope after Mark and my interview in this week's The Awake Space Astrology Podcast. All right, let's find out what's going to go on. Well, I told you don't panic, because panic doesn't do us any good. We can take a step back. I want to remind you that the media spinning right now isn't very helpful. They want everybody worried about the presidential outcome. I'm not saying it isn't a cause for concern, but I told you 2 years ago to pay attention to your local, pay attention to your city, pay attention to your county, pay attention to your state. And there's reasons for that. Look at what a lot of the Supreme Court rulings are doing. They're tossing those decisions down to lower courts. And so you want your lawmakers, wherever they may be, doing good by the people so that it doesn't have to go up there. And don't worry, they'll sort themselves out. 2025 is a very, very interesting year. Being overly panicked by the direction of the country is going to distract you from doing things that matter most to you, and that includes taking care of your own security. We're in a time where it's important to understand how our consciousness works. From a metaphysical level, the time we're in now, especially as we move towards the Mars-Uranus conjunction, is a time where those who are more able to stay steady in their consciousness can actually take advantage of that energy to be working from aligned and inspired mindsets. And those who are perhaps more reactive, is a term we can use, are going to be behaving in ways that don't move them forward, that they stumble over their own worry, doubts, and concerns. It's important right now to be able to, one, work with your breath. Remember to breathe, okay? And that we want to breathe deep inhales through the nose if you can. If you've got a deviated septum or your allergies are acting up, you can breathe through your mouth. But your exhales need to be slow, and you want to count those. You don't have to go to no mind in your meditations. Not everybody is good at starting there. I certainly wasn't. You can do active meditations, like when you take a walk or go for a run or lift weights or wash dishes or scrub the floor or go garden. It's time for you to really be more responsive to life than reactive. And reactive can include, oh no, what am I going to do? The panic, the adrenaline rush, the cortisol rush. None of that helps you. And we're so used to seeing the spiritual and the physical be disjointed, to people believing that the two are not intrinsically connected. And yet they are. Your physical being is not separate from your spiritual being. It's just we haven't been taught how to use them in an integrated manner. And practicing your breath is a very big first step to learning how to be deliberate in your consciousness. Now, it doesn't mean perfect. The power is in the noticing. Am I being reactive in the moment? Am I being responsive in the moment? The perfection's in the correction. Oh, I'm being a little reactive. Take a step back. Take a breath. Take another breath. Slow it down. Even in the face of things that rightfully cause concern. I'm saying all of this because the energy is really wild right now. And I don't just mean wild as in like astrologers gone wild. I mean as in the true sense of the word, like wild magic. As if time itself is spinning. And round she goes. Where she stops, nobody knows. And where she stops is based on every minor, little teeny tiny decision we make throughout the day. Do I get up and go have a glass of water, or shall I drink a cup of tea? Am I going to make that call that I promised to make, or am I going to ignore that moment and choose to do something else? And whereas our futures are always dependent on the little everyday decisions, right now, your timeline is highly dependent on the actions you take. You're not going to damn yourself, but some paths are easier to navigate than others. And recognizing when you're on the path, whatever path it might be it the one with brambles and stickers and thorns, or a more gentle path, things that are a little easier to move through, is really dependent on mindset. And This might be a time where some people do move through a dark night of the soul as they become aware of the consequences of their own beliefs, their own ideas, their own thinking. Because as hard as it is to look at what other people have done, some of the hardest knowledge to wake up to is to see where we have done things to ourselves. And that isn't victim blaming. I'm not saying you brought anything to you. But when we think unkind thoughts about ourselves, when we hold ourselves in harsh judgment, when we equate our identity with the things that have happened to us and around us instead of the very divine being that we are as a human. When we think that to be in this physical plane is a less than spiritual experience, when we are here to spiritualize matter, well, when we realize our thoughts play a role, that can be painful. Be gentle on yourselves this week, because there's going to be a lot of epiphanies for people who've been doing the work. And hopefully you also see where you have perhaps given yourself a little ease, and don't feel guilty for a heartbeat for that. We need people who pave the way. In the interview with Mark Jones, he brought up the fact, the Buddhist concept, that there are those who pave the way forward. And we mentioned the Alice Bailey work, and I believe we talk about that in the patron-only section of the podcast interview. But there's something called the rules of the road. And no one walks alone, and that's part of the rules of the road. No one is the first to take the first step on a journey, on the path. Each of us follows in the footsteps and in the light of those who have moved before us. And each of us lights the way for those coming behind us. And just because somebody's ahead of you doesn't mean they're better than you. It just means they started before you did. And that could have been 1,000 years ago. Each of us stands on the shoulders of one another, and each of us lights the way for yet another generation. And at this time, each of us needs to look at how our beacon shines. We're in for some very interesting times in July of 2024. And I know you're used to me giving the mundane predictions. But those of you who've been listening for quite some time know that when the energy is getting serious, that's when I put on my real hat. I've told you many times I give the mundane predictions because it gets your attention and it proves I know what I'm talking about. But my real purpose is to help you see the light in yourself, to help you understand how very precious you are, and that just by breathing on this planet at this time, you serve a purpose. And you can choose to enact that purpose in any way. In some ways are easier, in some ways are harder. And we get to choose our pathway every step of the way. So notice, time will be fluid. But so will your options be. So if you feel like, oh, I don't like this direction, I don't like how I feel, you'll very much have the opportunity to adapt your course very rapidly. So you can take a breath and say, well, what direction do I choose to go? Because you do, my dear, have that kind of agency. All right, I'm going to keep that part short, and we're going to head into patron shoutouts, and then we're going to hear the interview with Mark, and then we'll see how we end the episode. Well, holy moly guacamole. Once again, we've got a whole long list of patrons, and we're going to do 2 separate patron shoutouts this week because so many of you have joined to support the podcast. And I want to thank you for that. It's an honor, and as I always say, without you, there is no me. So we're going to try to do this in halves here. Big thanks to Jen, Overseer Eugene, H. Baird, Nisi, Brandy, Sam, Laura, Ricky, Rebecca, Kathy, Serene, Kelly, Jessica, Jill, Kara, Jihan, Hope, Russell, Aaron, Jean, Jess, Jenny, Connie, Matthew, Aaron, Reagan, Jennifer, Jason, Dahlia, Emmy, Ashley, Alexia, there we go, I can speak, Tracy, Trevor, Christine, Seth, Philip, Aaron, Chloe, Alexis, Allie, Trina, Stacy, Justin, Randy, John, M, Bobby, Shanisha, Susie, Melissa, Wolf Boy, Christine, Sayantika. And if I mess that up and I said it wrong, let me know and I'll pronounce it right next time. James, Jay, Julie, Angela, Justin, Kristen, Michelle, Robin, Sue, Alder, Stephen, Cannon, Brittany, Beth, Judith, Christina, Gronky, Maya, Jen, Joey, Myrna, Lucy, Nellie, Kelsey, Lainey, I love Teaspoon, Michelle, Katie, Tiara, Dorothea, Katrina, Eva, Lauren, Cece, Pamela, Mark, Carolyn, Stephanie, Patricia, Jen, Teresa, Elizabeth, and Devin. I think I'm going to leave it there, and we'll do the rest in the next segment. Now we're going to go over to that interview with Mark Jones. You'll be able to catch the second part if you want to know more about our take on astrology as a tool for growth and healing. And that'll be in the patron-only podcast that you'll get later this week in part 2 of this episode. I hope you enjoy. Right, I have a special guest with me, guys. I have Mark Jones. I almost called you Mark Edmund Jones there for a minute.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Feel,
right?
I know.
It was amazing to discover that you seemingly have the most plain name in the world, Mark Jones. Right. And then it turns out that the man that taught Dane Rudhyar astrology was called Mark Edmund Jones. How sweet was that? Yeah, that was a nice moment. I discovered it when I went to my first conference as a student in 1999 in the States. Mm-hmm. And the lady ticking the names off, the registrar, turned to the whole room and went, "We have a second Mark Jones."
Oh, right? And you're like, what the hell?
I know. I'm this young kid in my 20s. I just didn't know what to make of it at all.
Right. So you and I kind of got into astrology around the same year. It fell into me in 95.
Yes.
I didn't get to my first conference till I was in my 30s, but that's where I met Joanne Wickenberg and Jeffrey Wolfring. So we both, I went to Norwalk, the first one. So it was a good first salvo.
That is a good first salvo, and they're two good people. Yeah.
Very good. And so you tell us, instead of me telling the listeners about you, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone? Just because, I mean, I'm sure some of them know you.
At this point, I'm an astrologer, but I'm also a therapeutic ally to people. I'm a coach and trainer of a spiritual vision of psychology called psychosynthesis, which was created by an Italian doctor, Roberto Asagioli, who was a bit younger than Jung, Carl Jung, but he knew him and he knew Freud. And just as an aside, and we can go back to this, I was present in 2012 when they opened up the archive to a group of people, and I was shown Asagioli's astrology collection. And that's when it became clear to me that, because I already knew about Carl Jung's interest in astrology, it became clear to me that both the two significant followers of Freud had studied astrology enormously deeply and may even have been using it to inform their meaning-orientated vision of psychology. So that was incredibly significant to me. I mean, I discovered astrology because I was a student of various spiritual philosophies, and I trained initially with Warren Kenton, the Kabbalist astrologer in London in the early mid 1990s. So it was Kabbalistic astrology I studied to begin with.
That was really popular back in the 90s.
Yes, and he had a really he had a real quality around him, and he'd brought this incredible group together. But I only interfaced for one weekend. I went and studied astrology for one weekend. Then I walked into the center of London, Watkins bookstore, the esoteric bookstore, and I got mine and my friends' charts printed out. They had a piece of chart software, and they would print your chart out for like £3 or something.
Right.
And so I did that for all my friends. And strangely enough, from that day forward, I was treated like an astrologer just from having taken that step. So even though I didn't know very much, it was a kind of had that feeling of being meant to be. But at this point, you see, what I think your listeners might give them a sense of what separates me from many astrologers, not that I'm saying that they're not trying to be useful, is that I treat the psycho-spiritual growth element as primary. Yes. So the astrology is secondary.
Yes.
So I'm very much concerned about placing astrology in a healing context, in a helpful and healing context, and removing this sense of it being a kind of fatalistic construct where you open this Pandora's box and you're doomed to this fate.
This is why you're screwed. Yes.
Yeah. Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know.
Right.
You get the thing and then the big boulder starts coming for you.
Or your face melts off because,
you've opened the wrong thing. Yeah.
Right. Well, my listeners are very used to me saying, I speak against determinism.
Yes.
And so, because and as I came to it as many people do, like it fell into me. But once I realized it was this key to unlocking a vast amount of potential, and I wasn't doomed, like a psychologist told me at 15. And I didn't really believe them, but I kind of believed them because they were older and had degrees.
But that's such an important point.
Right?
Sorry, before you just move on.
Go ahead. Yes.
Let's recognize it's not just astrology, is it? There's so many professions, medical, psychological. They get caught in, don't they, just judging people effectively, imprisoning people with their concepts. Whether it be clinical diagnosis, whether it be astrological, whether it's your Saturn square moon, whether it's your borderline personality. Look, some of it's useful, but it's clearly an overprescribed world, isn't it? When a 15-year-old walks out of a therapeutic setting thinking I'm doomed, it's not a great...
Well, and it was trauma-based. It was because of, and my argument, even at 15, in 1985, I didn't even turn 16 yet, but this is like having an accident happen to you. I didn't cause this. And if we don't know everything about the brain, why can't I go on and be happy?
Exactly.
And they went, oh, no. And they gave me a litany of all the bad things that would ever happen to me. And some of them did, but not all of them. And I was like, but there's this thing called self-actualization. And I'd learned about it in middle school. Believe it or not, there's this thing. And I didn't know much about it, but I would go learn, and astrology suddenly became this, like, this opens it. Now it still takes time and work and, good therapists.
But the self-actualization is a term from Abraham Maslow. And it's interesting because Maslow and Asagioli are often grouped together in psychological books, but Maslow did it ground up. He did it looking at lab experiments. He did it, and then he saw these potentials, whereas Asagioli very much did it from a spiritual vision downwards. Right. Yeah.
But Maslow amended his theory, and they didn't publish it until after his death. And I ran across this, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now. And he had the theory of transcendence.
Yes.
And that doesn't get taught.
The transcending self-actualizer, that brilliant phrase, the self-actualization that gets to the point of transcendence. And he meant just
transcending circumstances. He meant transcending circumstances because he was looking at Viktor Frankl, and who had none of his needs being met, still went through his dark nights of the soul and came out the other side to be a person of service in the world, and many others. And I was really upset that we had never been introduced to that we only hear, oh, you have to have all these. And I thought, well, nobody makes any money off it, do they?
Well, we can be cynical like that, but also...
But I'm just kidding.
Psychiatry has gone through something of a sea change itself, I would argue. This idea of endogenous depression, it's just a brain chemical imbalance, I think has been largely disproven, personally. Now, there might be certain pharmacological companies who are still heavily invested in it.
Right.
I mean, cynicism around big pharma, which I think is justified in the psychiatric field and possibly others too, is one thing. But like you say, why aren't we looking at these models? Just like we look at post-traumatic stress, why aren't we looking at the very real phenomena of post-traumatic growth, which is also studied but less well known? Yeah.
Right. So talk about that for a minute and talk about how we can, like, how you pair that with your understanding of astrology.
The thing I experience with my clients at the deepest is certain very traumatic experiences or very intense experiences, including suffering, are often the launch pad for the deeper exploration of self that leads to a revolutionary act of individuation and experiencing their own essence renewed, phoenix-like, if you like. And I just think the attempt to live a human life without intensity and without suffering is perhaps naive and delusional. And this idea, particularly in the West, particularly say in America, you're an American, why should you be suffering? Just take this little Prozac pill. It'll make it all right. What do you do if you rob people, Laurie, of their suffering? You rob them of the meaningful obstacle. You rob them of the thing that they have to try and make meaningful and for themselves. And I think it's this meaning-making function that we've been lacking in psychology. And it becomes tremendously depressing when you look at certain forms of academic and clinical psychology. They don't seem to address the need, what Jung called the religious function of the psyche, the need psychologically to find a soul image or a unifying image of the meaning of your life. And I think the beauty of astrology is that it can act as a bridge to finding that soul image, that you can contemplate the chart as if it's a kind of multidimensional moving map of your own soul
I
potential.
see it in my head. Yeah. Forwards and backwards. And I just heard yesterday on a video, they've just released on Big Think, that these physicists think that there may be another arrow of time that is contextual in evolution. Now, they're not looking at human psyche, they're looking at the organization of matter. But I went, oh, but there is. There's more than one potential impossibility. I was very excited about that because I was like, okay, once they get it, we can expand on it.
Well, imagine if there is soul, right? If there is truly soul, like a transcendent form, then that soul would be streaming from beyond space and time.
Absolutely.
It would have to originate from something more than just the stream of space and time. So as it originates from that and it hits normal space and time, what's going on? There must be other complex phenomena. Who's to say if there are past lives and people remember them? People have experiences of remembering them.
Absolutely. Yep. We've talked
who's
about
to
that
say who's to say they're even past? Who's to say that from the soul's memory the soul could be experiencing multiple, as it were, memories at the same time. And the chart might be a key to this, what we could call contemplation of the multidimensional self. What we can say is...
I am going to say to most of my listeners, however, that requires a lot of study to be able to do so safely, mentally, when you're looking at an astrology chart. And one of the ways I do explain this to people who know enough to be dangerous is with astrology or any other subject, is I see it as the physical container for the soul expression, because you took your first breath in this body.
Yes.
And it's the roadmap for this body, and you can gain understanding as you actualize into other space time. But if you haven't done the healing work in this life, be cautious of going down the rabbit holes of past lives, because it can be a trauma response to not wanting to be embodied.
Exactly.
Ask
it can
me
also,
how I know.
Well, it can also be a glamorization, can't it, of trauma?
Yes,
So
yes,
you have trauma
yes.
now, and then you have 50 lives where this trauma happened, and oh my God, you'll never get out
or
of it.
Or you were the bad guy. That's something
Yes.
I went through as a young woman in my late 20s, early 30s. I must have been, even though I didn't blame myself for it. I mean, I knew I was a child, right? Consciously, I knew it. But then I went and was like, well, I must have been a real asshole in a past life. And then, this past life where I was a warlord and I was these, and we experience all of it as human beings. We're not always the victim. Sometimes we're the victimizer. Sometimes we're really good. And sometimes we don't do much with it. So I'm only saying it as a caution. Go ahead.
That birth chart is a symbol, isn't it, of that incarnational journey. You come in at this point, the little shaped hole in the universe that's got you on it. But even that, because I think that's the richest symbolism of astrology. Even the idea that the ancients had, that the soul journeys through the different planetary spheres before it lands on Earth, and that symbolizes where you've come from. Yeah. But I like to remind people who take astrology too seriously sometimes that, remember, it's just a space-time moment. It's not unique to you. If you were born in 1970, April 13th, Boston at 12 p.m., maybe a blackbird was born at that moment, or even a rodent in the basement of the hospital. Well, they've got your chart, but they don't necessarily have your potential. It's like the key to the meaning of astrology is this unique moment. It's what we're trying to say, that your birth symbolizes something about the arrangement of the whole planets of that moment. But you have to make it unique because other things may have been born at that moment, other children, birds, rodents, anything, a plant. They would all have that chart.
A coffee cup.
Exactly. Could have been made at that moment. So it's the unique property of consciousness that you bring with you that animates that chart. And that's why in a lot of my work, it's about listening to the person and where they're really coming from, not just studying their chart. It's about the unique marriage of their unique self with the symbols of the chart.
And I spend a lot of time on the show explaining that conscious expression is a spectrum. So when people, because for me, interpretation is the emphasis on a chart versus being overly focused on the math. The math is very important. You need to be accurate, but communicating the chart is essential. It's the once you have a calculation, and we have very good software today, and you should know enough to know if it's off, but the interpretation, I think, is lacking in many cases and very narrow. And so this is where people get into, as we talked before we started recording, the doom scrolling of this equation, Pluto or Venus square Pluto in my birth chart means I am forever screwed in this way, instead of it's a very dynamic and active and creative element.
Brilliantly put. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then people who are seeing an upcoming Pluto transit that might last for 2 or 3 years, and they're going, oh my God, my life's going to fall apart. I mean, if you step back for a moment and you say, well, and occasionally it might, but we can come to that in a moment. But if you
come out better for it.
Well, if you take the keyword transformation for Pluto, then you realize that in order to transform, things might have to break down.
They have to fall away
first. Yeah. Or if
and what is falling away? Is it the dysfunction? Is it the patterns of, family patterns? Is it the things breaking down? It can be painful, but it doesn't mean that it didn't need to happen.
Exactly. But if we're too attached to it, we can oddly go down with the ship, can't we? Needlessly, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah.
But, and again, if you take, say, a Saturn transit and you use the keyword maturation and you just say, it's really about growing up. Well, is growing up easy? Is it easy to grow up? No, because the child within wants everyone to carry on treating you like the loving parent, right? Assuming you had loving parents, which is not the case for everyone by a long stalk. But so if you only doom scroll with Pluto and Saturn, the great two that people treat that way, or maybe Mars as well.
Mm-hmm.
The so-called malefics, a term I dislike.
I can't stand it.
But it's so
we're
so
on
damaging.
the same page. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that, then what have you said? It's so ironic, isn't it? Because in a way, astrologers get caught in this position where they're effectively anti-transformation, anti-Pluto, or reducing Pluto to just a negative.
The destroyer.
Exactly. Or anti-Saturn, which is anti-maturation. It's anti-growing up.
Yeah. Anti-structure. Because it's crystallization. And I'm like, everybody wants to manifest. Well, what do you think plays one of the greatest roles in physicality?
Yep.
Saturn.
Well, and from my point of view, psychologically, how are you supposed to self-actualize in a true sense if you haven't gained a basic level of psychic autonomy or psychic maturation? And you see this as a real crisis in the modern world. I would argue our society is increasingly failing young people in terms of providing a meaningful initiatory structure.
Yes.
And that's very challenging because, in a sense, there's a lot of risk with Saturn. It's not like all these astrologers that say it's a malefic are just silly people. They're not stupid.
No.
They recognize that difficult experiences can happen.
Yes.
It's just that they're failing to recognize that difficult experiences might be tremendously rewarding in terms of the life of the soul and the deepening life through the course of your life. The sense of your overall meaning might be supported by many of these difficult experiences.
And it's also discipline.
Yes. Which people don't always like, do they?
No, and having the discipline, and people think of discipline as punishment, but in its true meaning being teaching, or having a practice that you do reiteratively. Saturn is a very useful space, and it can be a bummer sometimes, like when we don't get our way. I mean, I think we all like to get our way. However, and they're used to me saying Saturn's not always the bad guy. Saturn can be your best friend, and it can save your life.
In The Soul Speaks, I called it the guardian of our true potential.
Yes, I loved that. I was listening to the audiobook. I love that book. It was very fascinating. Talk about it being the guardian.
Well, it's like you started to say it, really. Without discipline or structure, what are you ever going to achieve? Saturn, in a way, it encourages you to define that which is worth becoming disciplined for. So you see people whose lives are a mess, but they join the military, or they become a parent, or they meet a significant partner who is worthy of growing up for or taking care of. So Saturn can represent these experiences where you're given this kind of almost like lesson in what matters to you and what it's worth showing up for. And if you haven't found what it's worth showing up for in your life, by the Saturn return, the first Saturn return in your late 20s, you're going to be really struggling, aren't you? Because in the meaning process of self-actualization and this influence of Frankl, this genius Frankl who went through horrific experiences in the Second World War and the Holocaust, losing everyone he knew and loved, but still working for the human, the betterment of the human condition and working with people all his life. If you're going to achieve that, then inner self-discipline becomes very important. His great point was terrible things can happen to you that you can't control, but you can control your response to them. That was his great point of agency. And I think that's key to Saturn. I think other archetypes are involved, but if you fail the Saturn lesson, what I might call the Saturn lesson, taking responsibility for your own actions and feelings and thoughts, then you won't get very far with the self-actualization project. And sometimes I think astrologers are too enamored of Uranus or Neptune. They're all like spacey and going, astrology is this deep cosmic thing. Saturn's just a heavy trip. Saturn is the shit your dad says or something. Push it away. But then you're really missing out. Yes. You're missing out on the discipline, on the maturation, on the thing that's worth growing up for. Whether that
I found the Saturn cycle where we look at, the first square, the opposition, the second square, the return, and you address that in the Soul Speaks book. when I teach about Saturn, I teach about that because you're 7, you're 14, you're 21, you're 28-ish, right? And then again, and those are really important developmentally, and I still can't say it, but as we develop along in our consciousness, we make important decisions when we're 7 years old.
Yes.
Not everybody has a Cancer Mercury to remember those, but at 14.
Well, because 7 is the formation of the personal self, effectively, isn't it? Prior to that, you're going through these different phases. Around 6 or 7, the child starts to put it together into an overall experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in our society and our culture, what do? You look at the light in children's eyes start to dim a little around 7, 8 years old if they've been kind of like overly socialized through the kind of industrial school model, especially in the States.
I think it's true in a lot of places.
Yeah. And then, and we want them we squash them so they fit and they're easier to manage. And then we wonder why people have a great amount of apathy in their 20s.
I mean, that's part of it, but I mean, it's also
apathy
obvious.
Is not feeling like they have agency, but go ahead.
I mean, people have to learn to read and write and to go through some degree of socialization, but but the industrialized model you're talking about and the way that with large class sizes, it tends to flatten out unique learning styles. Yes, it's clearly problematic. Although I think the apathy of young people in their 20s, I think we're finally starting to see the trickle-down effect of the loss of faith in larger cultural, religious, and spiritual values. As a culture, the sense of the sacred is going more deeply underground or has gone into fringe territories. I mean, I guess like astrology. I mean, it's part of the growth of astrology.
The spiritual movement is huge with young people. I have many of our listeners hearing you are Pluto and Sag bearing young people, which is exciting to me. Go ahead.
This
so
spiritual,
when you're talking about that,
well, it's a real spiritual dilemma, isn't it? Because there's a lot to be said for having your own faith and your own spiritual vision, but to have that without any of the pre-existing structures
frameworks
of religion or cultural forms, or whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, other religious forms,
Islam, Hinduism,
it's somewhat disembodied, isn't it? And then it creates a different set of problems. It's the problem I call the potpourri problem, where people just pick nice bits that they like from different traditions, and they create a nice little bowl of sandalwood and rose and frankincense. But is that the deeper point of the path? And I think some of the realignment of Carl Jung and Roberto Asagioli in psychology is to try and ground the psychological exploration of the 20th century, where we suddenly discover our interior psychic life in this deeper way. And it's to try and position that in a religious or spiritual tradition that's meaningful to people. I think that's explicitly what Jung is doing in the Red Book. For me personally, it's like a kind of, he has a sort of mystical revelation at the end where he's with his guide Philemon, and this blue shade comes into the garden with a kind of mystical Christ kind of quality, and just shines this quality of being into the garden. Carl was searching for these unifying images because it is very challenging. Even the Buddhists would recognize you have a refuge field. You have these people that walked the path before you.
Yes.
And we're in a kind of, now we can say on a deep level, like Krishnamurti said, truth is a pathless land, right?
Yes.
But it still helps to have a path to begin with, just to get to the place where you might have that insight. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I see where you're going with that. And I see that like today, the potpourri, as you said.
Yes.
Because people haven't been taught, and there's just this regurgitation of, oh, this person said that and this person said that, and if I get asked one more time if I need to make moon water on a full moon, my first question is, what are you going to do with it if you do?
Yes.
What is your purpose for making moon water? Are you doing it just because somebody said you make moon water? What are you going to do with it? And so, but people are searching, and then they've been trained in the idea of, if I do this, I'm damned. If I do this, I'm saved. And it's a prevailing thought form in culture and society. Even when the religions have lost power, those thought forms have remained very strong. And so it's like we have the mystery school at the Awake Space, and it's a blend of psychology and spirituality, but just giving a disciplined process for people to self-discover. Okay?
Yes.
So it's not an indoctrination process. It's a framework. Okay. Without dogma, except the meeting format, because it has to stay like that, or it doesn't last an hour. But through like theosophy, when you look at it, that was like, I think one of the attempts to transcend, even though it's still very inoculated with Christian thinking, because the brains that wrote it had been indoctrinated with Christian thinking. Where do you think, I think we're going to evolve spirituality. I don't think it's all going to collapse. I think it's getting restructured with Pluto in Aquarius as we go along, because society is restructuring. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think you're such more optimistic than me. I mean, I would say this. I would say that I think a certain percentage of people it will evolve, but it's an enormously challenging thing. Think of what Jung did. Jung was an enormously empowered person. He'd been treated by the founder of psychoanalysis as if he was the crown prince. He'd married the second richest woman in Switzerland. He was a creative powerhouse. He was brilliant at what he did. He was a brilliant artist. He just went with everything. And even he struggled when he went into the depths, wrestling with these spiritual questions. Mm-hmm. The problem we have is, and it's the role that priests used to play, if you like, right? People used to have trusted intermediaries, right? If you were a sincere workman who did roof tiles in Florence in the 16th century or something, you weren't necessarily required to have understood St. Augustine or the origin of the church fathers or something, right?
Right.
So you trusted this intermediary on your behalf, legitimately.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
People are struggling to find those intermediaries.
Right.
They're struggling to find the people to guide them. And they go to psychologists and they go to astrologers. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they're fortunate. Sometimes they're lucky and they find someone who can help. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they find someone who's just as imprisoned by the system that has denuded and lost the sacred as anyone else out there in the world. Yeah.
Well, I have hope because we have this thing called the internet, which sometimes is a place of hubbub, but once in a while we can be a beacon of light.
I like that. I do believe that.
Yeah.
I mean, even a conversation like this is kind of miraculous, isn't it? We're thousands and thousands of miles away. Yeah. We connected at an event, a charity event organized by the London School of Astrology at the Royal Albert Hall. And it was delightful. It was a delightful day, wasn't it? And shout out to Frank Clifford and everyone who made that happen.
Yes. They did a beautiful job. And I got to hear you. I was in tears. I have a Libra moon. I don't like to cry in public, but I couldn't stop. I'm also a Cancerian. So that's square. But you spoke to my life's work. And I was like, in America, I'm sure you know, astrologers like us don't exist a lot.
Yes.
And you studied with Jeffrey Wolfgreen. I studied with Jeffrey Wolfgreen. You got to study with Noel Teal. And I got all of his books at a used bookstore when I was a struggling single mother in 1998, 99 in Portland, Oregon for $1 a piece on his whole Communicating the Horoscope series.
Yes.
And that was divine intervention because I was like, yes.
He was just so good at explaining the technical stuff, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It was a slog reading through them. Yes. It was very technical. But
you wouldn't want to do that all the time, would you? But it was a gift. Yeah.
No, it was a gift. And we do have to kind of do some of blending discipline with ease, I think helps Oda. Thank you. So,
but this point about the kind of astrologers, this is one of the forks in the road around this point about spirituality, right? Mm-hmm. There needs to be research astrologers. There needs to be astrologers focused on magic or the moon cycle or, doing different things on different planetary cycles. But that's not what's going to really help people. What people need is people who have chosen to be guides or mentors or therapeutic allies
Yes.
And they need a specialized training. They need a specialized path in order to help people. And that's what I'm trying to create in my spiritual psychology coaching training, in the different masterclasses I teach. I'm building this body of students who are fluid in both astrology and therapeutic concerns and techniques.
Absolutely.
Because of the empathy and compassion I feel for those young people you're talking about. Genuine, spiritual, sincere dedication. But when you look around in the world, where are you supposed to go with that right now that you can trust?
Right. Oh.
And I've dedicated my working life to trying to address that question based on my own needs, really, from my own 20s.
Yeah. Oh, I hear you. Same thing. Giving people a space to become a safe space. And when I train astrologers, their very first class, whether it's beginning or intermediate or they're mentoring with me, is ethics. Isn't it?
That kind of ally to people, that kind of guy.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So everybody, you can check the show notes. You can find Mark's work there. And I know I have a lot of therapists listening. I would much rather have you go to Mark for training on therapeutic use of astrology, because I am not a therapist. And I say that all the time. I'm just well-studied and well-versed in healing because I had to. But everybody has a different path too. And astrology can help light that way as well. So thank you so much, Mark. It was a pleasure. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that was a fantastic conversation. I hope to speak with Mark again. It was such a pleasure having him as my guest. And again, part 2 of that interview is in the patron-only podcast. So let's get to the rest of the patron shout-outs before I give you a little more of a rundown on what we can expect as we move towards that Mars-Uranus conjunction that happens on the 15th. Okay. And if you're patrons, I already talked about what I see happening at the Republican convention and at the Democratic conventions in like about a week and a half ago's patron-only podcast. So big thanks to Marie, Jessica, Shelley, Amanda, Jacqueline, Cheryl, Glenn, Frosty Girl, Dot, Whitney, Dr. Shut Your Face, Jessica, Tessa, Lindsay, Patty, a girl from Montrose, Neen, Alyssa, Monica, Jalen, Melly, Ashley, Emily, Mimi Draws, Veronica, Allison, Lori, Carmen, Blamps, Alexandra, Lynn, Mother of Fangora, Jack, John, Erica, Margaret, Jennifer, Rain, Gary, Tina, Christina, Casey, Brendan, Sarah, Charmaine, and it's Charmaine Joan, I believe, Larrikin, the Daydreaming Mickey, Christy, Pam, Simple Syrup, Jocelyn, Monica, Cheryl 62, Anna, Maria, Jennifer, Elizabeth, Anna, Jennifer, Judith, Lily, Ronnie, Jay, Antonius, Janet, Lindsay, Tina, Jasmine, Elle, Carmen, Kimberly, Ree, Roman, Bex, Kathleen, Celia, Yama, Christina, Cindy, Nicole, Rebecca, Heather, Gina, Latonya, Kel, Dina, Blair, Eleanor, S. Quintana, Kelly, Brittany, Sheila, and Jonathan. Thank you so much for your support of the Awake Space Astrology Podcast. I am honored. I am honored that so many people have come in to support this podcast, where I give as much information as I can to help you make it through these crazy times. Oh, and it is crazy. We're going through massive systemic change. That is something that does not happen overnight, nor do we want it to. It takes time. And if you want things to get better, you got to work on you, because you really do have a great influence, even if it doesn't feel like it. The more you can grow inside of you and gain self-understanding and become more responsive, the more the ripples spread out into the world. And I think we're seeing people realize their collective power in ways that I think we haven't before as a species. And so I have great hope in this time. So now I'm about to go rattle some cages as I tell you what to expect this week and how you can move through this energy. Okay, I talked about that at the top of the show, and I'm going to talk about it at the end of the show because I think we all need a little reminder now and then to take a deep breath and exhale slowly so that we can be as responsive as possible, even in the face of challenging circumstances. So, of course, Miss Oda, the Wonder Dog, has come over while I'm recording this and is expecting scratches. So if you hear heavy breathing, that's the dog, not me. This week is wild because Mars is moving in an approaching conjunction to Uranus. And like I've said before, I said it at the beginning, the people who do not wield their consciousness deliberately maybe acting out a little bit. And even those of us who do wield our consciousness with deliberation may find ourselves a little challenged. We all may be feeling like flinging mashed potatoes at each other at some point as we move through the week. It will be easy to become unsettled in this energy. You might feel angsty. You might feel edgy. You might feel like like the song that Pink sang, I want to get in trouble. I want to start a fight. You might be feeling on edge. You might be tired of it. That's okay. It's normal to feel these things. When we're doing the work, and whatever the work is, when we're working on ourselves, we so often admonish ourselves for the intensity of our feelings or for the inappropriateness of those feelings, whatever they are, whether we want to wring somebody's neck or, feel like hitting our car in reverse too hard. It's normal to think those thoughts. It's another thing to act on them. Okay. So in general, the average person who's pretty good at not acting on their impulses should be all right. And then there's those who suck at that. And we're going to see them acting up. I would not be surprised if we see some violence happen out in the world. That's pretty startling. Okay. And it could be vehicular. It could be like a semi-truck. It could be somebody with access to heavy moving equipment. It isn't necessarily like the bad guy with the gun, although it could be. But it's something that's going to be like what the actual F. Okay. I know I have little ones listening. So, although this is probably not the best episode to have little ones listening at this point. So there's going to be some stuff in the news. And then we have the Republican convention, which I expect actual fisticuffs on the floor. I expect violence to break out during the convention. I just do. Whether it's violence at a leader themselves or even having a leader have like a cardiac arrest or a stroke and it could be Trump, but it could be somebody else. Trump could basically tell them to fuck off and he doesn't want to be president anymore. That is one thing that could happen. Or it could be he tells all these people, like with the Project 2025 and the abortion rights people, to fuck off. And it looks like he's already kind of leaning in that direction because he's a freaking wrecking ball. Okay. He's nobody's ally. He's in it for him. There's nothing that man does that says he's going to align one way or the other. And so they're going to get a taste of their own medicine with him as a loose cannon. And that should be pretty funny. Don't worry about it. I don't see him becoming president. I just don't. I don't think he has the transits. And I do run at an 87% accuracy rating, guys. So Now, did I say he was going to lose? No. But I'm not even convinced he's the candidate. So, and even if he ends up the candidate out of that convention, I'm not convinced. So there's interesting stuff up on deck. If you're a patron, then you can go listen to that podcast in the Patreon where I talked about the debate. It was last week, the debate. Let's see, the RNC, the DNC conventions and all that fun stuff and what I see happening there. But it will be very unsettling on a personal level. Remember, everything can be going to hell in the rest of the world and you can have a great day. Okay. You don't want to borrow other people's misery right now. That doesn't make you a better person. Just because you see a tragedy going on and you feel for those people, that's one thing, having compassion. But if you're diving into the depths of misery and suffering, you are not helping them because you're in the problem. And in these times, for the foreseeable future, we need solution-oriented people, not problem-oriented people. And it doesn't mean you're without compassion. Okay. And there will be events that take place that galvanize people into action. And this is very galvanizing action. And how does something become galvanized? It tends to have a shock. Okay. So there will be some very interesting and shocking events that lead up to the 15th and even some days after that. Okay. As the Mars moves towards Gemini. And then we have a whole nother thing going on when Mars hits Gemini and it's trine Pluto and Aquarius. And thank God Pluto is in the early degrees, at the 0 degree mark, because if it was in the later degrees, it would bear a lot more weight, be a little more intense. We'll look at that 20 years from now. But for right now, and it could be weather too. It could be any and all of that. Remember, astrology isn't just one thing. Astrology is a framework that describes the reality that is present, the potentials, the possibilities, and the probabilities of the future. The future is not set in stone. Okay. It's like a tree with many branches, and those branches are dependent on the individual decisions made. Many small decisions on a daily basis create the future from the collective itself. Okay. And so that's why I've been telling you, the more you work on you, even a small amount of progress is enough to tip the balance. We do not need every single human being deliberately wielding their consciousness. We just need a critical mass. And I think we're closer to that than we ever have been. I've watched some real potential rough times be avoided, just like by the hair of our chins. And likewise, I've watched us miss some really great opportunities to make enduring change. So as you wake up, as you move forward on your journey, as you unfold, because even if you're awake, you still unfold. What do you do with your day? How do you use your energy? Where are you applying your focus? Those are all things to ask yourself as we move forward. So let me take a look at that 2024 year ahead. Also, Paris, I really expect either an unfortunate accident or a terrorist attack to happen in Paris with the Olympics. It looks like the left coalition won on that snap election. So it's very interesting to see people fighting right-wing extremism at the ballot in Europe and the United Kingdom. So that gives us a little bit of hope. Hopefully that happens in the United States. I kind of think Texas might swing purple. I think Florida's probably a lost cause. But I think we might see Texas swing purple. What does that have to do with spirituality? Everybody's like, well, I'm spiritual. I'm not into politics. I don't think you can be spiritual and not be involved, because politics is part of being human. And as humans, we are spiritual beings having human experiences. And one of those is politics. So when we avoid the human experience, it's not very spiritual. It's a hard one. I resisted that one tooth and toenail when I was younger. But here we go. So we're looking at there's a big event on the 14th or 15th of July, depending on where you live in the world, as Mars conjuncts Uranus. And again, this could be a mass violent event, and it could also be a natural disaster, or it could be more than one event globally. I do think it's very likely to see an increase in volcanic activity and an increase in seismic activity. I think the Olympics could have echoes of 1972, which that was a really tragic terrorist attack in the Olympic Village. There could be an attack or violence, or you could see a bad accident or tragedy. Nationalists of all flavors get very active, and potential violence might increase, especially around July 22nd. And legal matters become the focus, could see important people under legal strain. The weather is volatile, and harvests are impacted globally in a negative way, and the tea gets hot as we move forward. Scandals spill all over the place. And you have to remember, we're building towards that full moon at 29 degrees of Capricorn on the 21st of July. Oh no, it's my birthday. What will I do? I'm going to eat cake. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to eat cake on my birthday. Maybe a piece of pie. I don't know. I'm going to go see my mom because I'm a Cancer. And I haven't spent my birthday with her since, I don't know, my daughter was a baby, I think. A long time ago. You can still have a good day. Borrowing other people's tragedies debilitates you from being of service. Okay. Remember, Virgo's the healer. Virgo doesn't jump in to the problem or the wound. Virgo holds space for healing. Okay. And I'll argue that Virgo is every bit as compassionate and empathetic as Pisces. But when you're joining into the suffering, you cannot help alleviate the suffering because you're in the same resonance as the problem. It doesn't mean you have to be cold and heartless and say, so what? You can do this with great feeling. Okay. And it doesn't mean you're not going to see things and cry, and you're not going to, we all do when people are suffering. But if you allow it to become your experience and your trauma, one, it's rude because it isn't yours, it's somebody else's. And they need and deserve to have their experience. And you can't fundraise, you can't resource, you can't. You need to take that energy and put it into some kind of action. And I think with Mars conjunct Uranus, it's a real opportunity for people to be galvanized into inspired action. That is the highest expression of that energy. Being spurred by your guidance to take action that serves a greater purpose, to force stability by disrupting the status quo, which includes people's suffering. So those radical acts, and that's what I hope we see. Now, I'll be reading all of the articles from the Awake Space magazine for patrons at the $15 level and up, because people want story time. I realize we put everybody to sleep with the podcast voice, and I take that as a great compliment that you feel soothed. But one of those articles is on the Mars-Uranus conjunction, and it's called Radical Acts. Okay, Radical Acts. You're like, Laurie, you're all over the place. You talk about politics and consciousness and how I can work on my individual thing versus the collective. And yes, welcome to life. It is not an either or situation. It is an and both. So the thing about this Mars-Uranus conjunction that's coming up on the 14th, 15th, depending on where you live in the world, is that it is hard to pin down on what will happen because Uranus is wild card energy. Okay. It will be disruptive. And from a mundane perspective, I fully expect to see some seismic event. Okay. Or it could be erosion events. And it could just be those volcanoes that already started going off, Stromboli and Mount Etna, but we could see another bit of rumbling happen. You got to remember that Uranus is the planet of disruption, rebellion, and revolution. I know everybody keeps talking about Pluto and Aquarius and it being around revolution. It's not. Revolution is Uranus. Pluto is transformation. Okay. And in the case of it being in transit through Aquarius, it is transformation of society and humanity, because Aquarius is the sign that governs humanity. Pluto is also about power. And society is having to realize that each one of us as individuals, when working in concert towards a shared aim, collectively have power. And that's why it's important to work on yourself, discover your agency, because we all have it, right? And the more we exercise that as individuals, the more we can group together with others with agency to make a difference. And how is that not a spiritual thing? So, regardless of what happens out there in the world, just know you can take a deep breath. You might have to take 10 or 12, maybe 20. You can step away. And then you can decide, how can I be catalyzed into a radical act that makes a difference? I think we often think of radical as things that are destructive or hurt people or violent, but you can radically love yourself. You can radically care about people. You can be radically kind. You can radically communicate. One of the most subversive things you can do is radically accept yourself. Because when you can do that, you're less likely to be projecting all over the place to other people. And that makes the world just a little bit better. And like ripples in a pond when a pebble gets tossed in, it makes a difference. So that's your mission this week. Should you choose to accept it, I'm going to head off and work on the patron-only podcast now, which you can find if you click the link in the show notes. And you can also check out Mark Jones' website with all the information for his training program. If you're a therapist or you're wanting to take a therapeutic approach using astrology, it's a beautiful pairing. And I highly recommend Mark's work. I'm Laurie Rivers, and I want to thank you for listening to the Awake Space Astrology Podcast.